Chapter 1. The House That Held Secrets. The key turned in the lock with a reluctant groan, as if even the door didn't want to open. Emma Harper pushed gently, the hinges protesting after years of silence. Dust greeted her like an old acquaintance, swirling in the shafts of sunlight that cut through the lace curtains. The farmhouse stood still, not abandoned, just untouched, exactly as her grandfather had left it. A cracked coffee mug still sat on the kitchen table. His wool coat, weathered and faded, hung on the wall peg by the door. The calendar was still turned to October, 3 years ago. A box of oatmeal sat open on the counter like he meant to return after breakfast. But he hadn't. A sudden stroke had taken him while visiting her father's house, and no one had been back here since. The family couldn't bear it. Too many ghosts. Too much history. And now the burden fell on her. Emma let out a long breath, sliding her backpack off her shoulder. The floorboards creaked beneath her as she moved through the rooms. Her boots echoed like a stranger's footsteps in a house that once felt like a second home. She hadn't been back since she was 17. That summer, she remembered, Grandpa had told her stories by the fireplace, stories of a time before her father's bitterness, before the world grew cold and small. He always spoke gently, eyes full of memory and something deeper, something like regret. Now, the silence spoke louder than words ever could. It was in the attic that everything changed. She climbed the narrow staircase and pushed open the hatch, the musty air thick with dust and time. The attic was a place of shadows and sunlight, boxes, furniture draped in sheets, forgotten photographs in cracked frames. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Maybe keepsakes. Maybe closure. What she found was a small wooden chest. Old. Ornate. The kind of box that felt heavy with more than just weight. She knelt beside it and wiped away years of dust, her fingers trembling slightly. The latch wasn't locked, just stiff. With a firm nudge, it popped open. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Most were addressed to her grandmother, sweet notes, birthday cards, mundane but loving. But one envelope stood out. Thinner, older, yellowed with age. The address caught her breath. To my dearest Lila. June 14th, 1968. She stared at the handwriting. It was familiar, her grandfather's script. She'd seen it on Christmas cards, Bibles, even a check he once wrote for her college books. But this wasn't addressed to her grandmother. Who was Lila? With a hesitant breath, Emma slipped the letter from the envelope and unfolded it carefully. The paper felt delicate, as if it might crumble in her hands. But the ink was still sharp, still alive. Lila, if you're reading this, it means I never had the courage to hand it to you myself. I've spent every day thinking about what could have been if the world had just been kinder, if I had been braver. There isn't a day I don't remember the way you laughed beneath that willow tree, or how your hand fell in mine the last night before they tore us apart. Emma stopped. She felt as though she had opened a door that was never meant for her. The words were raw, intimate, not youthful infatuation, but real, aching love, the kind carved out by time, by suffering. She read on. I tried, Lila. I really did. But they wouldn't let me. And I was too afraid of losing everything. But I see now. I lost you. And that was everything. The letter ended abruptly. Torn at the bottom, the signature missing. Maybe lost, maybe cut. But one thing was clear. This wasn't some idle flirtation. This was a hidden love story. Buried in silence. Hidden in her family's attic. Emma stared at the name again. Lila. Why had she never heard of her? And why did this letter feel like the beginning of something she couldn't yet name? Something waiting in the shadows of a truth long forgotten. Outside, the wind moved the branches of the trees, and somewhere below, the old house creaked as if exhaling. Emma carefully placed the letter back in the envelope, but her heart wasn't still. Because some stories don't stay buried. Some stories demand to be told. And this was one of them. Chapter 2. A letter with no ending. Emma didn't sleep that night. The farmhouse walls felt tighter after reading the letter, like the air had changed, like the space itself now held a presence. She lay on the couch downstairs, staring up at the ceiling, the sound of the wind brushing past the shutters. Lila. That name echoed in her chest like an unfinished sentence. She'd never heard of a Lila mentioned in any family story, not once. Not during holidays, not during Sunday dinners, not even in passing gossip. The way her family told it, her grandfather had one love, her grandmother Margaret. A loyal man. A good man. Simple. Quiet. But the words in the letter had been anything but quiet. They pulsed with ache. They told of another world, one hidden behind the neat picture her family painted. A world that didn't fit the narrative. At sunrise, Emma sat back at the small wooden kitchen table, the letter unfolded beside her. Coffee steamed in her mug, untouched. She stared at the ending again, torn, raw. But I see now. I lost you. And that was everything. And then nothing. No name. No goodbye. Just that gaping white space where the most important part should have been. The part that signed it, claimed it. It was personal. Painfully so. Yet at the same time, it didn't feel like it belonged to her. She wasn't sure what to do with it. Was it meant to be found? Was she trespassing in someone else's heartbreak? She gently folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. She needed answers. Later that morning, she called her father. "Morning, Em," he answered, groggy. "How's the house?" "Dusty. Full of ghosts," she replied. "You're being dramatic." "Dad," she hesitated, then dove in. "Did Grandpa ever talk about someone named Lila?" Silence. The kind that lasted just a second too long. "No." "Are you sure? I found a letter. In the attic. It was addressed to someone named Lila. From him." I said no. His voice was sharper now, clipped. "Your grandfather was a good man, Emma. Don't go digging up things that don't matter." "I'm not judging him, Dad. You don't know what you're messing with. Just clean out the place and come home." He ended the call before she could say anything else. Emma stared at her phone. His voice hadn't been defensive, it had been afraid. She knew that tone. Her father didn't rattle easily, but when something touched a nerve, he shut down. And clearly, the name Lila was radioactive. So she did what any curious woman would do. She drove into town. The local diner hadn't changed since she was a kid. Same red vinyl booths, same hum of conversation and coffee brewing. Emma slid into a corner seat and pulled out her notebook. She wrote the name in bold, Lila, 1968. She tapped the pen. Then an older voice called out from behind the counter. "Well, if it isn't little Emma Harper." Emma looked up to see Rosie Evans, her grandfather's old neighbor and a town legend in her own right. Rosie had to be near 80 now, but her eyes were sharp, her voice sharpener. "Rosie," Emma smiled. "Still keeping this place running?" "Someone has to. What brings you back to the land of porch swings and gossip?" Emma hesitated, then pulled the envelope from her bag and laid it on the table. Rosie's expression changed the moment she saw the handwriting. "You recognize it?" "Hard not to. Your granddad had a writer's hand. Poetic, even when he was just signing bills." Emma lowered her voice. "Do you know who Lila was?" Rosie glanced around. The diner was mostly empty, but even still, she leaned in. "You found that name, and no one threw a fit." "Dad shut down. Told me not to dig." Rosie sighed, folding her arms. "That sounds about right. The Harpers have always been good at sealing up what hurts." "So who was she?" Emma pressed. There was a long pause. Rosie stared at the envelope, then out the window, as if searching the past. "Lila Jameson. She lived 3 houses down from your grandfather growing up. Bright girl. Smarter than the whole school put together. Kind. And beautiful. The kind of beautiful that made men stupid." "What happened to her?" Rosie looked away. "She disappeared. Just like that." "No," Rosie said quietly. "Not just like that. There was a scandal. People said she was involved with someone she shouldn't have been." Whispers turned into stares. Then one day she was just gone. Her family moved north a few months later. Never came back. "Someone she shouldn't have been with?" Emma asked. Rosie met her eyes, carefully. "This town used to be divided, honey. By streets. By churches. And by skin." Emma's stomach dropped. "You mean?" Rosie nodded. "If your granddad loved Lila, it wouldn't have been allowed. Not back then." Emma sat in her car afterward, staring at the photo she'd taken of the letter. Her mind spun with everything Rosie had revealed. A love that couldn't survive. A woman erased from history. A grandfather who never stopped mourning. And suddenly, she knew. This wasn't just a letter. It was a doorway. And she had just stepped through. Chapter 3. The Name No One Spoke. The next morning, Emma stood in the attic again, staring at the photo she'd found wedged between the pages of her grandfather's Bible. She hadn't noticed it at first. It must have fallen when she closed the book the night before. It was old, creased at the corners, and faded to soft sepia tones. A man and a woman sat on a porch swing, not looking at the camera, but at each other. A gaze so intimate it felt like Emma was intruding. The man was her grandfather. Younger, his eyes alight with a kind of joy she had never seen on his face in person. And the woman, she had dark, flowing hair and a smile that didn't belong to anyone in the Harper family. Emma didn't need a caption to know who she was looking at. Lila. She held the photograph carefully, afraid the weight of truth might crumble it to dust. How many years had this been hidden away? How many times had her grandfather opened that Bible, seen this photo, and remembered? Emma thought of Rosie's words. If your granddad loved Lila, it wouldn't have been allowed. Not back then. History wasn't just painful. It was buried and protected. Later that day, Emma stood in her Aunt Caroline's flower shop. Petals fluttered as the door closed behind her, and the warm scent of lilac and baby's breath filled the space. Caroline looked up from behind the counter and smiled. Well, if it isn't the prodigal niece, she said. Emma forced a smile. Figured I'd come by before I disappear into boxes again. Caroline wiped her hands on her apron. How's the house? Still holding secrets. There was a beat of silence. Emma reached into her bag and laid the photograph gently on the counter. Caroline's eyes froze the moment she saw it. I found it in Grandpa's Bible. Caroline didn't speak, didn't move. Who is she? Emma asked softly, though she already knew. Her aunt picked up the photo as if it might burn her fingers. You shouldn't have found this. But I did. Caroline set the picture down and leaned against the counter, her expression tight. You want the truth? She asked. Emma nodded. Her name was Lila Jameson. She and your grandfather were in love. Real love. The kind that could have changed things, maybe even the town. Then why didn't it? Caroline gave a bitter smile. Because the town wouldn't let it. And neither would our family. Emma's chest tightened. He was engaged to Grandma at the time, Caroline continued. But from what I understand, it was arranged more for appearances than love. Margaret came from money. Lila didn't. But it wasn't just about class, was it? No, Caroline sighed. It was about color, race, respectability. Your grandfather was told, in no uncertain terms, that if he didn't end things with Lila, he'd be cut off, disowned, shamed. And he listened. He tried not to. From what I know, he tried everything. But eventually he caved. Emma looked away, sickened by the weight of legacy. He married Grandma, settled down, had Dad. But he never really let go, did he? He ended the call before Caroline could say anything else. He didn't. Emma stepped outside into the afternoon sun. His voice hadn't been defensive. Her heart had been heavier than it had been in years. She knew that tone. The town looked the same. Her father didn't rattle easily. Sidewalks. But when something touched a nerve, children riding bikes. And clearly, but beneath the name Lila was radioactive. Roots of choices. So she did what any curious woman would do. She drove into town. And the local diner hadn't changed since she was everything else was starting to unravel. Same red vinyl booths. She returned to the conversation before coffee brewing and placed the photograph on the corner next to the letter. Pulled out her notebook. They belonged together. She wrote the name in relics of a love story never 1968. She opened the journal her grandfather used. Then an older voice called out from her father had labeled private. If it isn't little Emma Harper. Inside were pages of scripture, Rosie gardening notes, her grandfather's old neighbor, and then, in a town legend in her own right. A single page Rosie had to be near 80 now, 1968. But her eyes were sharp, just 3 days after the letter. Today I buried something Emma sacred. Smiled. Her name, keeping this place running. The promise I made beneath the willow tree. What brings you back to the land of folded them up and tucked them into a corner of my soul so then pulled the envelope from her bag and laid it on the table. I hope Rosie's expression changed the moment she saw the handwriting. I never stopped. You recognize Emma closed the journal. Hard not to. Her hand shaking. Your granddad had a writer's hand. This was no passing romance. Poetic. This was when he was just torn by the world. Emma lowered her voice. Silence. Do you know who Lila was? She looked back at the attic. Rosie glanced around. Had waited. The diner was mostly empty. She knew the name Lila didn't just belong in a letter. You found that name, and no one belonged in the light. Dad shut down. Told me not to dig in the floorboards. Rosie sighed. Emma had lived enough life to know that once you uncover the truth, Harpers have always been good at sealing politely on her shelf. It demands. She. Emma pressed. Now there was a long pause. Demanded Rosie more. Stared at the envelope. She couldn't just walk away from then out the window. Not when it was staring her in the face. Lila Jameson. A legacy of love she lived and loss 3 houses down from your grandfather growing up. Of her family bright home. Girl. She returned to the attic that night. Put together. The August air was thick and beautiful, heavy with the kind of beautiful that made men stupid. A storm whispered somewhere in the distance. Rosie looked away. Low rumbles pulsing against the walls like footsteps from long ago. Rosie said quietly. Emma sat on the attic floor with the photo. There was a scandal and letter beside her. People said she was involved with someone where she had found the box. Whispers. She ran her fingers along the floor. Then one day she was noticing one that her family moved north a few months later. Slightly under pressure. Never came back. Curious. Someone she shouldn't have been with. A soft crack. The Rosie met her eyes with a groan, carefully, revealing this town used to be divided, honey. She reached in.
By streets.
Her hand brushed
By
paper,
churches.
stiff
And by skin.
delicate. Emma's
She
stomach
pulled out
dropped.
a small envelope.
You mean
Yellowed
Rosie
but
nodded.
intact.
If
In
your
a black
granddad
velvet
loved
pouch.
Lila, it
Her
wouldn't
heart
have been
thudded.
allowed. The pouch
Not back
held something
then.
solid. Emma sat in her
Inside
car
was a
afterward,
locket.
She
Staring
opened
at
the
the photo
photo
she'd
on
taken
one
of the letter.
side. A
Her
miniature
mind's filled
photo
with
of her
everything
grandfather,
Rosie had
just like the
revealed.
one in the journal.
A love that couldn't
on the
survive.
other, a woman with
erased
erased
from
brown
history.
skin and bright,
A grandfather who
laughing
never
eyes.
stopped mourning.
Lila.
And suddenly,
Emma stared at
she
the two
knew.
of them. This wasn't
Heart
just
twisting.
a letter. They
It was a
belonged
doorway,
together,
and she
even
had
in
just stepped
miniature.
through.
Even
Chapter
in hiding.
3.
Inside
name
the
no one
envelope
spoke.
was a note.
The next morning,
Handwritten, Emma stood
folded
in the
into
attic
fourths.
again,
Lila,
staring at the
if
photo
this
she'd
ever
found
finds you,
wedged between
know
the
this
pages
locket
of her
carries the
grandfather's
only
Bible.
two things
She
I
hadn't
ever
noticed it
truly
at first.
cherished.
It must
I should
have
have
fallen
fought
when she
harder.
closed the
I
book
should have
the night
chosen you.
before.
But I
It
was
was
young
old
and afraid,
creased at the corners,
and not enough of a
and
man.
faded to
I
soft
built a life
sepia
without
tones.
you, but I
a
never
man
lived
and a
it.
woman sat
I'm
on
sorry.
a porch swing.
If there's still
not
time,
looking at the
come
camera,
back.
but at each
If
other.
not,
A
I
gaze
pray
so
heaven is
intimated
kinder than
felt
this
like
town
Emma
ever
was
was.
intruding.
Yours
The
always.
man was her grandfather. Her
Younger.
grandfather signed
His
this
eyes
one.
alight with
Eli.
a kind of joy
The name
she
felt
had
heavier
never
now.
seen on his face.
Not
in
just a
person.
man who sat
And the
quietly
woman,
in a rocking
she had
chair,
dark
or taught
flowing
her how
hair
to fish.
and a smile that
He had
didn't
loved
belong
fiercely
to anyone in the
he had
Harper
failed
family.
deeply.
Emma
And he
didn't
had
need a
mourned,
caption to
not
know
just
who she
a
was
person,
looking at,
but a future
Lila.
that was stolen.
She held the
Emma
photograph
wiped her
carefully.
eyes.
This
Afraid
wasn't
the
just
weight
a
of
letter
truth
anymore.
might
It
crumble
was an
it to dust.
inheritance of sorrow.
How many years
and
had
a
this
call
been
to
hidden away?
reconciliation?
How many times
That
had her
night,
grandfather
she laid the
opened that
locket
Bible,
beside the
seen
photo
this photo
and the letters,
and remembered?
She snapped
Emma
a
thought
picture
of
of them on her
Rosie's
phone.
words.
Heart
If your
racing.
granddad loved Lila,
She needed more answers.
it wouldn't have been allowed.
Not just from family.
Not back then.
From records.
History wasn't
From
just
archives.
painful.
From
It was
her.
buried.
Was
and
Lila still
protected.
alive?
Later that
Did she
day,
ever get any
Emma
of these
stood in
messages?
her Aunt Caroline's
Emma
flower
opened her
shop.
laptop and
Petals
began to
fluttered
search
as the door
anything
closed
she could
behind
find.
her, and the
She
warm
typed
scent of
Lila
lilac
Jameson,
and baby's breath
1968,
filled the space.
Georgia.
Caroline
and
looked
scrolled
up from
through
behind the
ancient
counter
newspaper
and smiled.
clippings, digital
Well,
archives,
well,
even
if it isn't the
ancestry
prodigal
forms.
niece,
She
she
found a
said.
yearbook
Emma
photo.
forced a smile.
Lila at age
Figured
17,
I'd come by before
smiling,
I disappear
top of
into
her
classes
classes.
again.
A mention
Caroline
of her
wiped her
receiving
hands
a
on her
community
apron.
leadership award.
How's the house?
Then nothing.
Still
No
holding
wedding
secrets.
announcements.
There was
no
a beach of
obituary.
silence.
Just a void.
Emma reached into
until
her
she
bag
searched
and laid
Lila
the
Jameson
photograph
plus
gently
Georgia
on the counter.
plus home for
Caroline's
women.
eyes
One
froze
small
the
care
moment
home
she
popped
saw
up
it.
2
I
counties
found it
over.
in Grandpa's
Silver
Bible.
Pines assisted
Caroline
living.
didn't speak.
Emma clicked through
Didn't
the
move.
site,
Who is
scrolling
she?
until she
Emma
saw the
asked
staff
softly,
photo. Though she
and
already
there,
knew,
standing
her
behind
aunt
a
picked up
nurse,
the photo
was a woman
as if
in
it
a
might burn
wheelchair,
her fingers.
silver-haired,
You shouldn't have
fragile,
found this,
but familiar.
but I did.
It couldn't
Caroline
be.
set the
Could it?
picture down
Emma zoomed
and
in.
leaned against
The
the
eyes,
counter.
the
Her
smile,
expression tight.
the shape of her face.
You want the truth?
It had to
She
be
asked.
her.
She
Emma
sat
nodded.
back in the attic.
Her name was Lila
heart
Jameson.
pounding like a drum.
She and your
She had
grandfather
found her
were in love.
After all
Real
these
love.
years,
The kind
Lila
that could have
Jameson was
changed
alive.
things.
And
Maybe
now,
even the
Emma
town.
had to decide.
Then why didn't it?
Would she show up
Caroline
at her door
gave a
with a
bitter
broken
smile.
locket?
Because the
story
town
Lila
wouldn't let
never
it.
asked to relive?
And neither would our
Would
family.
she risk
Emma's
tearing
chest
open
tightened.
wounds that had barely
He was
scarred?
engaged to
Or would
Grandma
she
at
go?
the time.
Because some
Caroline
truths aren't meant
continued.
to stay in
But
boxes.
from what I understand,
some truths
it was
demand to be
arranged more
delivered.
for appearances
Chapter
than
5.
love.
The cafe
Margaret came from
confession.
money. Emma
Lila
didn't
didn't,
drive straight
but
to
it wasn't
Silver
just
Pines
about
the
class,
next morning,
was it?
She meant to.
No, Caroline
She even
sighed.
packed the letter,
It was about color,
photograph,
race,
and the locket in a zipper
respectability.
pouch.
Your
and
grandfather
placed it
was
gently
told
in her tote
in
bag
no
like she was
uncertain
handling an
terms
artifact.
that if he didn't
Which,
end
in a
things
way,
with
she
Lila,
was.
but
He'd
her
be cut
hands
off.
trembled too
Some
much to start the
shame.
car. And he
What was
listened.
she supposed to say?
He tried not to.
From
I
what I
found
know,
love letters
he
my
tried
grandfather
everything.
wrote you
But eventually
57
he
years
caved.
ago.
Emma
Thought
looked
you might want
away,
to cry about it
sickened
one
by
last
the
time.
weight of legacy.
She wasn't ready.
He married
So
Grandma.
instead, she
Settled
walked
down.
to Main Street
Had Dad.
and ducked
But
into
he
Willow's
never-
Cafe,
he never
the
really
oldest
let go,
shop in
did he?
town besides the barber and the church. The smell of cinnamon rolls and roasted beans comforted her instantly. She sat in the corner booth, facing the street. Her nerves buzzed like static. That's when Jasper walked in. He hadn't changed much since they were kids. Taller, broader now, with a few scruffy lines in his jaw and a quiet steadiness to his presence. Jasper Hines had always been gentle, one of those men who didn't take up space loudly, but when he was near, things felt calm. He spotted her instantly. "Well, look who the storm blew back," he said, grinning as he slid into the
the seat across from her. Emma Harper, still allergic to small-town life. She smiled faintly. Maybe. Still building barns and charm at the same time. He laughed. Only when the weather lets me. I heard you were back. She paused, then reached into her bag and laid the letter on the table, the envelope yellowed and trembling slightly in her fingers. He looked at it, then her. This isn't a coffee order, is it? Jasper, she said softly. Do you remember anyone named Lila Jameson? His smile faltered. For a beat, he said nothing. Then he leaned back in the booth, eyes narrowed like he was sifting through time. Yeah, he said at last. I do. Emma waited. She was beautiful, he said, voice quiet. But not just the outside kind. She walked like she carried truth in her bones. My mom used to say she made people uncomfortable in all the right ways. Did you know her well? Not personally. I was young, but I remember the way people changed when she was around. She worked at the library for a while, organized the first youth literacy drive in this town, brought kids from both sides of the tracks together. Emma raised an eyebrow. That sounds bold for the time. Exactly. He nodded. And bold gets punished, especially when she and Eli Harper started walking together. My grandfather. Jasper looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and knowing. They didn't flaunt it, but people saw. Whispers turned to tension. I remember my dad saying Eli was either the bravest man in town or the most foolish. Emma's breath caught. What happened? They disappeared one weekend, he said. Just gone. Everyone thought they'd run off together. But when Eli came back alone, he wouldn't say a word. Not then. Not ever. And Lila? No one ever saw her again. Rumors said she moved north. Others claimed she was forced out. All I know is, Eli changed after that. He got quiet. Never smiled the same. Emma slid the photograph across the table, the one of her grandfather and Lila on the porch swing. Jasper picked it up, lips parting slightly. Wow, he whispered. Look at him. He looks alive. Jasper nodded. Like the version of himself I only ever saw in stories. They sat in silence a moment, the weight of memory folding around them. I found her, Emma said finally. I think she's still alive. In a home a couple counties over. Jasper's eyes widened. No way. Emma nodded. And you're going to see her? I don't know what I'll say, she admitted. I don't want to reopen pain. But you will, he said gently. Truth does that. It hurts. But it heals too. She looked at him. What if she doesn't want to see me? Then you respect that. But you'll know you tried. And maybe, just maybe, she's been waiting for someone to bring her peace. Emma took a shaky breath. Jasper reached across the table and covered her hand with his. You're doing something sacred, Emma. Don't let fear turn it into a secret again. That afternoon, Emma got into her car. The pouch with the locket and letters sat beside her. And this time, her hands didn't shake as much. She had a destination. She had the truth. And soon, maybe, she'd have closure. Chapter 6, Silver Pines. The road to Silver Pines was lined with oaks that bowed toward one another, their limbs arched like guardians of time. Emma drove in silence, the hum of her old sedan merging with the rustle of wind through leaves. Each mile forward felt like a mile back through decades of silence, through unspoken pain, through the story no one dared tell. The gates to the home stood tall, white, and clean. Silver Pines assisted living, dignity, care, legacy. Legacy. Funny, how that word had followed her all week. She parked and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. Her heart thudded like a knock waiting for permission to enter. In her tote bag were the letter, the locket, and the photo. She didn't know what would happen next, only that she had to try. Inside, a nurse greeted her warmly. Are you here to visit someone? I hope so, Emma said. Lila Jameson. I think she may have known my grandfather. The nurse's smile dimmed slightly. Miss Lila doesn't get many visitors. She might not know I'm coming, but I need to see her. Just to talk. The nurse studied her a moment, then nodded. I'll check if she's up for company. Emma waited in the sunroom, heart pounding. She stared out at the garden, neat rows of azaleas and lavender blooming in quiet dignity. After a few minutes, the nurse returned. She said yes, but don't expect much conversation. Miss Lila's memory comes and goes. Some days she's here. Other days, she's somewhere else. Emma nodded. Thank you. Lila's room was simple, neat. A quilt of blue and rose tones lay folded over her lap. Sunlight bathed the space in a warm glow. And there she sat, the woman from the photograph. Her hair was silver now, soft and pulled into a gentle bun. Her frame was thinner, fragile. But the eyes hadn't changed. They held stories. All of them. Emma stepped in slowly. Hi, I'm Emma. Lila turned, her gaze slow, cautious. I'm Eli Harper's granddaughter. There was no flicker of recognition, no intake of breath, just a polite, gentle nod. That's a good name. Emma smiled faintly. He thought so too. She sat across from her, laying the photo carefully on the small side table. I found this, Emma said softly, in the attic, along with some letters. Lila glanced at the photo. At first, nothing. But then, her fingers twitched. She reached forward slowly, brushing the edge of the picture. Her hands trembled. I remember that porch, she whispered. Emma held her breath. I was wearing a yellow dress. He liked that dress. Lila's voice cracked. Said I looked like sunrise. Tears welled up in Emma's eyes. I think he meant to send you this, she said, placing the unopened letter gently on her lap. Lila stared at it. For a long time, she didn't move. Then, with great care, she opened it. Her lips moved as she read, her fingers curling around the edges of the page. When she reached the end, a tear slipped silently down her cheek. I waited for this, she whispered. Emma felt her own tears fall. I think he never stopped loving you. Lila nodded, slowly. I know. Emma took the locket from her bag and placed it in her hand. When Lila opened it, she let out the smallest, breathless sound. She held it to her heart. I thought the world erased us, she said. Emma knelt beside her. It didn't. Not anymore. For a while, they sat in silence. Just two women, bound by a story that spanned generations. One who lived it. One who uncovered it. I don't have much time left, Lila said finally, her voice thin but steady. Emma reached for her hand. Maybe not, but you still have a voice. Lila smiled, tears shining in her eyes. Then help me use it. That day, they began to record. Emma returned with her phone, her laptop, a microphone borrowed from the local school. She hit record, and Lila began to speak. She told the story no one had asked for. The one buried beneath pride and shame. The one rooted not in scandal, but in love. And Emma listened, capturing each word like a sacred heirloom. Because some stories don't just deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be told. Chapter 7. When the Wind Carries Secrets. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Emma would arrive at Silver Pines every morning, her voice recorder fully charged and her heart open. Lila would be waiting in her chair by the window, the locket always around her neck now, as if it reminded her that love, once real, could never truly vanish. Each session peeled back layers of the past like pages in a journal that had never been written. I was 19, Lila said one morning, when your grandfather first spoke to me. I dropped my books outside the library. People walked past me, some on purpose, others pretending not to see. But he stopped. She smiled, the memory painting warmth across her aging features. He knelt to help, then asked if I liked poetry. Emma raised a brow. Did you? Hated it, Lila grinned. But he made me want to love it. He made a lot of things feel possible that year. They'd meet under the willow tree behind the old schoolhouse. Whispered conversations. Hands brushing. A future imagined, though never promised. He called me sunlight, she whispered. Said I made the shadows disappear. Emma's chest tightened. Did anyone else know? Lila hesitated. One person. Your grandmother. Emma blinked. She saw us once, Lila said. I think she knew before anyone else. She didn't yell, didn't accuse. But the next day, Eli didn't show. She paused, voice cracking. That was the beginning of the end. On the third day of recording, Lila asked Emma to stop the recorder halfway through. I need to tell you something off the record, she said. Emma nodded and shut the device. I wasn't just pushed out, Lila said. I was threatened. Emma's heart stilled. Your great-grandfather visited my father one night. Told him if I didn't disappear quietly, there'd be consequences. For both families. She stared out the window, the memory darkening her eyes. My father loved me, but he also feared this world. So he packed our things. No goodbye, no letters. Just a one-way trip to Chicago. Emma's hands clenched into fists. They made your grandfather marry Margaret. And he did, because he thought it was the only way to keep me safe. Emma swallowed hard. And did it? Did it keep you safe? Lila turned to her. It kept me alive, but it didn't let me live. That night, Emma sat in the farmhouse attic again. The air felt different now. Not heavy, sacred. She opened her laptop and uploaded the recordings, naming the folder. What Love Never Forgets. The True Story of Eli and Lila. She stared at the screen, heart full and breaking all at once. Then, something caught her eye in the corner of the attic. An old hat box she'd somehow missed. Inside were small slips of folded paper. Dozens. Each one was a prayer, written in her grandfather's handwriting. Lord, protect her. Lord, forgive me. Lord, let her know I never stopped. Emma pressed her hand over her heart. These weren't just regrets. They were repentance. And somehow, even after all these years, they had reached her. Chapter 8. What the Heart Leaves Behind. The following week brought unexpected news. When Emma arrived at Silver Pines that morning, A somber-faced nurse met her at the front door. "She's not doing well today," the nurse said gently. "You may want to sit with her." Emma's breath caught. Not yet. Not now. She walked down the now familiar hallway, passing the garden where she and Lila had shared lunch just days earlier, where Lila had laughed, truly laughed, at something Emma had said about her grandfather's clumsy handwriting. Now, the air felt different. Still, almost sacred. Inside the room, Lila lay back in bed, her quilt pulled up to her chest. Her eyes were closed, but her lips moved slightly, whispering something inaudible. Emma moved closer and sat beside her, taking her frail hand gently into her own. "I'm here," she said, her voice soft. "Lila, it's me." Lila stirred just enough to open her eyes, a flicker of recognition passing through them. "I remember," she said quietly. Emma smiled, tears already gathering. "I brought the locket," she whispered, unfastening it from around her neck and placing it back in Lila's palm. "I want you to have it again. You were the beginning of this story, and I want you to know it's being told." Lila held the locket to her chest, her eyes misty. "I never thought anyone would care to listen." "I care," Emma said, "and I think the world will, too." For a moment, a deep peace settled over the room. Lila turned her head slightly and whispered, "I saw him." Emma blinked. "In a dream," Lila said. "He was waiting beneath the willow tree. Same place, same time. He looked at me like he used to." She smiled faintly. He wasn't angry, just waiting. Emma pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by the beauty and sorrow of it. "He always loved you," she said. "I know," Lila whispered. "And I always forgave him." Silence settled over them again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of grace, of something holy. Lila Jameson passed away 2 days later, peacefully, with the locket still in her hand. She had no known family left, no children, no next of kin. But when the staff asked if Emma would speak at her memorial, she didn't hesitate. On the day of the service, Emma stood in a small chapel at Silver Pines, facing a few rows of residents and staff members who had grown to admire Lila in her final years. She held the locket in her palm and the folded letter in the other. "She was more than a name lost to time," Emma said, voice trembling. "She was someone who loved deeply and was deeply loved in return, even if the world didn't understand it." She looked out at the crowd, eyes wet but steady. "This isn't just a story about the past. It's a story about silence, about courage, about what happens when love isn't allowed to speak." She glanced upward, heart full. But now it has. That night, Emma returned to the farmhouse and uploaded the final audio file. The full story, titled simply, "What Love Never Forgets: The Hidden Romance of Eli and Lila." She attached the recording to a new podcast series, and then something strange happened. It began to go viral. Not overnight, not explosively, but slowly, steadily. Comments trickled in from around the country. "I cried. This reminds me of my grandparents. I thought stories like this were lost forever. Thank you for telling this." And then, an email. From a woman in Chicago. *Emma. "My mother was Lila's neighbor for 30 years. She always said Lila had a story to tell, but never told it. I just listened to your recording. Thank you for giving her a voice. She'd be proud." Emma smiled, closed her laptop, and looked up at the stars. Some stories live in whispers, in boxes, in the cracks of old floorboards. But when the time is right, the truth rises. Chapter 9, Dust in the Light. Emma stayed in town for days after Lila's funeral, but something about her stay had changed. The farmhouse no longer felt haunted by memory. It now carried presence. A weight, yes, but a beautiful one. She spent her mornings in the attic, piecing through journals, letters, and old notebooks she'd overlooked in the rush to find the truth. She spent her afternoons in the library downtown, scanning microfilm and digging through archives. Her nights were quieter now. No more pacing or rereading letters. Now, she wrote. She wasn't just archiving history. She was living in it. One afternoon, while sorting through an old chest near the fireplace, Emma discovered a stack of bound notebooks, labeled in her grandfather's handwriting. "Conversations with God. Things I never said out loud." For her, that last one made her pause. She opened it, and immediately, tears welled. Inside, the pages were filled with little stories, not grand declarations or sermons. Just fragments. A favorite memory. A scent. The time they danced in the rain behind the old train station. Each entry was signed E. Each one was addressed to you. She read one aloud into her phone and posted it as a short audio clip under the title. If you loved someone but lost them, this is for you. The response was instant. My father never spoke of my mother like this. Where can I hear more? Please don't stop sharing these. Emma didn't realize it yet, but she had unintentionally opened a door, not just for herself, but for others too. People wanted to hear more than sensational stories. They wanted soulful ones. Ones that rang true. Later that week, Jasper stopped by the farmhouse. He brought a box of peaches from the farmer's market and 2 mason jars of sweet tea. He noticed the pile of notebooks, papers, and digitized files growing by the living room wall. You planning to start a library? He asked, smiling. Emma chuckled. Something like that. She hesitated. Then, Jasper, you knew Eli when he was older. Do you think he was happy? Jasper took a long sip of tea before answering. No, he said finally. But I think he had peace near the end. Some men carry their ghosts quietly. He stopped fighting his. Emma looked at the journal again. I wonder if he ever believed God forgave him. Jasper met her eyes. Maybe the better question is, did he forgive himself? Emma's throat tightened. There was so much grace in that one sentence. So much weight. That night, Emma started a new recording. But this time, it wasn't Lila's voice. It was hers. She told the story from her own view. Of finding the letter. Of the attic. Of the drive to Silver Pines. Of seeing the moment 2 souls met again through time. And then she read from Eli's journal. You don't always get to fix what's broken, but you can name it. And once it has a name, healing can begin. She ended the episode with a thought she hadn't written down. It just flowed out. Maybe grace doesn't mean forgetting the past. Maybe it means letting love rewrite what shame tried to erase. She uploaded the episode late, not expecting much. By morning, it had over 40,000 downloads. People from around the country were sharing their own lost letters, their hidden love stories, the things they had never said out loud. Emma realized something profound. She wasn't just telling a story. She was becoming the keeper of many. And yet, a question still pressed at her heart. What now? What did she do with this house, this story, this mission? Could she leave it all behind and return to city life like nothing had changed? Or did she owe it to the voices of the past and the aching hearts of the present to stay? Outside, the late September sun spilled through the windows. Dust floated like golden snow in the beams of light. Emma stood in the doorway of the attic, clutching the journal labeled for her. And she whispered aloud to the silence. I think I found my calling. The wind shifted through the eaves of the house like a breath. A presence. A blessing. Chapter 10. A place to come home to. 1. 500 words. Autumn had come in full blaze. The trees surrounding the Harper farmhouse wore their most brilliant colors, fiery reds, burnt oranges, and golden yellows. The air carried a chill that bit gently at the skin but invited warmth and reflection. Each morning, Emma wrapped herself in an old wool sweater she'd found in her grandfather's closet, brewed a strong cup of black coffee, and opened the attic windows to let in the fresh air as she worked. The farmhouse, once dormant and quiet, had become a living story in motion. She'd transformed one of the upstairs rooms into a small studio. Foam padding lined the walls. Her microphone stood proudly on a new desk, surrounded by stacks of handwritten letters, old journals, and dusty cassette tapes she was slowly digitizing. The podcast, Letters We Weren't Meant to Find, had officially passed 100,000 downloads. It had only been 6 weeks. Emma couldn't believe it. Comments poured in daily. This helped me forgive my father. I cried. I never cry. My mother never spoke of her past. I wish she had. Thank you for sharing yours. But the most touching were the quiet ones. I feel seen. One Tuesday morning, Emma walked into the quiet, wood-paneled town council office. A middle-aged clerk named Dee Dee looked up from her desk, glasses perched at the end of her nose. Back again, Miss Harper, she said with a kind smile. Emma nodded. Yes, I want to talk about rezoning the property. Dee Dee raised an eyebrow. You want to sell? Emma shook her head. I want to transform it. Dee Dee folded her hands. Into what exactly? A community storytelling center. A place for people to come and remember. To speak the things they never had the chance to. To heal. The words felt strange at first. Too big, maybe. But Dee Dee leaned back in her chair and let them settle in the air. That's the most hopeful thing I've heard all week, she said, her voice quiet.
Later that afternoon, Jasper stopped by the farmhouse. He brought 2 bags of groceries and a few old extension cords. "You really think people will come to tell their stories?" he asked as they hauled boxes from the barn to the newly cleared front parlor. "I don't just think it," Emma said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "They already are." She showed him an email from a woman in Maine who had written to say her grandfather had served in the same infantry division as Eli. Another from a retired nurse in Michigan who had known Lila as a young woman but never knew the full story. Jasper whistled. "Well, I'll be. You're building something sacred here." Emma smiled. "I hope so. I don't know what I'm doing half the time." Jasper glanced around at the space, the photographs on the walls, the fresh coat of paint, the bookshelf filled with memory. "I think you're doing just fine." That weekend, Emma hosted her first live reading on the farmhouse porch. She wasn't expecting a crowd. She had posted a small flyer at the library, one on the bulletin board at the coffee shop. Maybe a dozen folding chairs lined the porch, and a small table with mason jars full of apple cider and cinnamon sticks. To her surprise, more than 30 people came. They were young and old, locals and a few from out of town who had followed the podcast. A girl no older than 16 clutched a worn leather journal to her chest. An older couple held hands the entire evening, eyes never leaving Emma's face. She cleared her throat and looked at the stack of papers in her lap. "This is one of the letters I found in a notebook marked for her," she said. "It was written by my grandfather. He never sent it, but maybe he hoped someone, someday, would find it." She read, "I saw you in a dream again last night. You were barefoot and laughing under the willow tree, just like the first time. They say memory fades with time, but your name, it burns brighter with each year. Maybe I won't get to say this face to face in this life, but in the next, I hope you'll be waiting." Silence. No coughs. No shifting chairs. Just stillness. Then, the girl with the journal spoke. "That's the kind of love I thought only existed in movies." Emma smiled gently. "Sometimes it doesn't survive the world, but that doesn't mean it wasn't real." After the guests left and the sun dipped below the hills, Emma lingered on the porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Jasper joined her, 2 mugs of cider in hand. He handed her one. "You changed something tonight," he said. "Did you feel it?" Emma nodded. "Like a door opened. Like people are waiting to share, but they don't know where to start. That's where you come in." She looked out over the darkened fields. Fireflies danced near the barn. The willow tree swayed gently in the wind, its branches like arms reaching toward the past. "I think this house is more than a home now," she whispered. "It's a keeper of what matters." The next morning, Emma woke to hundreds of new messages in her inbox. Someone had recorded a clip from the porch reading and posted it on TikTok. It had already reached over 200,000 views. She stared at the screen, stunned. Her phone buzzed. A notification from a popular podcast network. "We love your voice and your mission. Are you open to a distribution deal?" Emma covered her mouth, overwhelmed. She thought of her grandfather, of Lila, of all the things never said, now finding light. She wrote back, "Yes, but only if we keep it personal. No scripts, no edits, just the truth." They replied in minutes. "That's what we're looking for." By the end of the week, the farmhouse had been officially approved for rezoning. Emma had plans drawn up to build a second structure, a small studio, with a reading room and space for visitors to leave letters behind in a memory box. She called it the Listening House. The local paper wrote a piece on it. The headline read, "Local woman turns family farm into story sanctuary." Emma laughed when she saw it. It wasn't about going viral anymore. It was about planting something that would outlast her. That night, she returned to the attic one more time, locket in hand. She sat by the window where the moonlight poured across the floor in a silver ribbon. She opened the journal again, flipped to the last page. There, in faded ink, her grandfather had written, "I pray this letter finds the right hands. If not hers, then someone who'll understand why I wrote it. Love never really dies. It just waits for the right voice to carry it home." Emma pressed the page to her chest. She wasn't just the voice. She was the home. Chapter 11. When the story becomes yours. The first time Emma was invited to speak on a national podcast, she nearly declined. She'd received the email on a gray Wednesday morning, the kind where the clouds never lifted and the wind tapped lightly against the farmhouse windows like a forgotten knock. She read the invitation twice. It was from The Quiet Hour, a top-charting show that blended personal storytelling and deep interviews. They wanted to feature her. Her story. The farmhouse. The locket. Eli and Lila. It felt too big. Too soon. Emma set her phone down and made herself tea, hoping the anxiety would settle with a splash of honey. She wandered into the attic studio, the place that had quietly transformed into her heart's epicenter. The microphone waited on the desk. The shelves were full, not just of her grandfather's journals now, but of others. Boxes had arrived from listeners across the country, filled with letters never sent, stories never told. One package had come with a note. "You made me brave enough to remember again. Thank you." Emma read the email again. Maybe this wasn't about her anymore. Maybe it never was. The interview happened on a Friday afternoon via Zoom. Emma sat in the upstairs room of the farmhouse, sunlight pooling over her shoulder as the host smiled through the screen. "You've created something really special," the host said after the introductions. "Why do you think people are so drawn to forgotten love stories?" Emma hesitated. Then, because we all have one. Even if it wasn't romantic. Even if it was a parent, a friend, a sibling we lost too early. We carry unfinished stories in our bones. And we hope someone, somewhere, will understand them. The host nodded. "Why now? Why do you think this story matters today?" Emma looked down at the worn cover of the For Her journal in her lap. She smiled softly. "Because we're all so loud online. And yet, most of us are still unheard. Lila and Eli didn't need fame. They just needed a witness. Sometimes, that's all a person really needs. Someone to say, 'I see you. I remember you. You mattered.'" There was a pause. Then the host leaned forward and said, "That's beautiful." After the episode aired, everything changed. Emma's inbox flooded. Producers reached out. Journalists called. A publishing house offered her a book deal to adapt the podcast into a collection of essays and letters. But one message stood out from the rest. It was handwritten, and it came from a nursing home in Vermont. Emma opened the envelope gently. Inside was a folded letter. Asterisk, "Dear Miss Harper, I was a friend of Lila Jameson when we were just girls. We shared a dorm at St. Cecilia's for a year before she transferred. She was smart and stubborn and had the loudest laugh in the room. I never knew what happened to her. I'm sorry I lost touch. Thank you for reminding me of who she was." Asterisk. Emma held the letter to her heart. Later that evening, she walked the property, bundled in her coat, hands deep in her pockets. The barn had been converted now, half recording studio, half library. The front porch still held the chairs from the reading weeks ago. She couldn't bring herself to fold them away. She passed the willow tree and paused. There was a new bench beneath it. Jasper had installed it quietly, without ceremony. Just a small plaque engraved at the top. "Some love stories wait a lifetime to be told." Emma sat down. She listened to the wind, the creak of the branches, the quiet hush of the land preparing for winter. She remembered something her grandfather once wrote. There is no such thing as too late when grace is involved. The following Sunday, Emma hosted another live reading. This time, the crowd had doubled. Chairs spilled out onto the grass. A small speaker system had been rigged up by a high school student who volunteered after hearing her podcast. The reading wasn't from Eli's journal this time. It was from a woman named Carla in Texas who had sent in a letter about the first boy she ever loved. He had died young, in a car crash. They had never even kissed. But she wrote him letters for years afterward. Emma read. Asterisk. I never got to say goodbye, so instead I said everything else. I told him about my college days, my heartbreaks, the day I got married, and the day my son was born. Maybe that sounds silly, but to me, he was still listening. Asterisk. When Emma finished, a quiet sob broke from someone in the crowd. Emma looked up. Faces were wet. Arms were linked. People had stopped pretending they didn't carry their own ghosts. And somehow, it made the air feel lighter. After the crowd left, Emma found herself alone with Jasper again. He carried 2 mugs of cider and his ever-reliable silence. He passed her a mug and gestured toward the barn, where warm lights spilled out of the windows. You've built a sanctuary, he said. Emma shrugged. I just listened. That's harder than it sounds. She smiled. I don't think I knew how to hear people before this. He nodded. The ones who speak the most don't always listen the best. She looked over at him. That's a very poetic thing to say. Been listening to your podcast too much. They laughed, but Emma's eyes turned serious. Do you think I'm doing the right thing, Jasper? Turning my family's land into this strange mixture of memory and story and sound. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pointed toward the house. toward the old attic window where lights still glowed. "You see that?" he said. "That house has stood for 100 years. But it never felt alive until you started speaking through it. You're not turning it into something else, Emma. You're turning it into what it always wanted to be." She swallowed hard, emotion catching in her throat. "I miss them," she whispered, "even though I never really knew them." Jasper touched her shoulder gently. "You know them better than most ever knew their grandparents. You met them through their truth. That's rarer than gold." That night, Emma opened her notebook and scribbled a new quote for the next episode. "When we inherit silence, we can choose to let it end with us, or we can turn it into something holy." And then, for the first time, she spoke a story of her own. Not Eli's, not Lila's, not one from a listener. Hers. Of growing up wondering why no one talked about the past. Of nights she felt like her voice didn't matter. Of finding the letter in the attic. Of deciding to answer it. Some stories aren't just passed down. Some are handed back, redeemed by the ones brave enough to tell them right. And Emma Harper had become exactly that. A storyteller. A keeper of grace. A home for the forgotten. Chapter 12. The one she wrote for herself. Winter announced itself without apology. The morning frost glazed the porch steps, the window panes etched with delicate patterns like the whispers of time itself. The once vibrant maple trees had shed their final leaves, leaving bare branches that reached toward the sky like quiet prayers. Inside the farmhouse, it was warm. Not just from the fire crackling in the hearth, but from the purpose that pulsed through every floorboard, every letter, every story Emma had brought to light. But this morning wasn't about letters from the past. This morning was about the one she had yet to write. She stood at the attic desk, staring at a blank sheet of ivory paper. There were 100 things she could have written. Thank you notes to listeners, another narration for the podcast, a memory fragment from her grandfather's journals. But this letter, it wasn't for an audience. It wasn't even for Eli or Lila. It was for her. Emma uncapped her pen, and the ink flowed like a river waiting to find its mouth. "Dear me, you made it through the silence, through the ache of not knowing, through the loneliness of being the only one asking questions in a room full of people too afraid to answer. You uncovered a story no one else could have carried. And in doing so, you discovered your own. I'm proud of you. Not because you built something others could see, but because you became someone you could trust again. Keep listening. Keep remembering. Keep healing. Some stories change the world. Some stories change a girl sitting alone in an attic, trying to make sense of why her name is written in ink that was never meant to be found. Both matter. With love. Me." She folded the paper carefully and slid it into a small envelope, sealing it not with wax or glue, but with a breath of peace. Then she placed it into the cedar box that held all the most meaningful letters. The ones that weren't for show. The ones that saved her. 3 days later, the farmhouse doors opened wide once more. This time, not for a reading or a podcast taping, but for an event Emma called The Gathering. Flyers had gone out weeks in advance, and interest had been overwhelming. Volunteers helped hang fairy lights around the barn and string photos across lines of twine. A projector was set up to display scanned letters and quotes across the loft wall. Tables were filled with pens, typewriters, and blank cards where guests could write their own unsent words. There was no stage, no central speaker, just space. To remember, to release, to rebuild. Emma wandered the room slowly, soaking it all in. A teenage boy typed furiously at one of the typewriters, lips pressed tight in concentration. A middle-aged woman sat at the memory box with a letter in her lap, unreadable emotion flickering across her face. Near the snack table, an elderly man shared an old photo with a stranger who listened like he was hearing scripture. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud. But it was holy. At one point, Jasper found her near the edge of the barn, arms crossed, eyes soft. "You did it," he said. Emma smiled, then shrugged. "I didn't do it alone." "You started it," he replied. "That counts for something." They watched as a little girl helped her grandfather hang a handwritten note on the wall of memories. It simply read, "I miss your laugh." Emma blinked back tears. "Jasper, do you ever think about what would have happened if I'd never found that letter?" He nodded. "All the time. I might have sold this place. I might have left. Maybe. But I didn't." "No," he said, "because the story wasn't finished yet." That night, after the guests had gone and the barn lights had dimmed, Emma walked through the house one last time. Each room held its own echo.
The kitchen where she'd nearly given up. The attic where she'd found her voice. The porch where strangers had become witnesses. And as she returned to her room, she noticed something taped gently to her bedroom door. A letter. Unmarked. She opened it carefully, unfolding the creased paper with cautious hands. Emma. Asterisk, you don't know me, but your story saved my marriage. My wife and I stopped talking years ago, not out of anger, but silence. One day, I played your podcast during dinner. We listened to Eli's words, to Lila's ache, and then we cried together. For the first time in a decade, asterisk. Asterisk, she told me she'd been writing me letters she never sent. We read them together. We started over, asterisk. Thank you. You helped me find what I thought was gone forever. A listener in Ohio. Emma pressed the letter to her heart and wept. Not because she was overwhelmed, but because she was exactly where she was meant to be. That Sunday, she uploaded her most personal episode yet. No music, no editing, just her voice, raw and full. Asterisk, sometimes we find letters we were never meant to read. Sometimes we write ones we never intend to send. But somewhere in between is the truth that binds us. That love, the real kind, the quiet kind, the unspoken, undeserved kind, never dies. It waits, and when we're ready, it finds us. Asterisk. She closed the episode with one final sentence, one that would echo in the hearts of her listeners long after the episode ended. Tell your story, or someone else will write your ending for you. Chapter 13, Full Circle. The snow came early. It blanketed the farmhouse in white, softening its edges like a dream fading into morning. The willow tree stood bare and noble, limbs etched in ice, casting long shadows across the field. Inside, the scent of cinnamon, firewood, and paper hung in the air. Emma sat at her desk in the attic studio, staring at the blinking cursor on her screen. This was the final episode of Season 1. The podcast that had started as a whisper in the attic had now grown into a worldwide chorus. Letters poured in weekly from all over the globe: Poland, Ghana, New Zealand, Peru. Stories, regrets, confessions. Some were anonymous. Others were signed with full names and addresses, as if the writers needed the world to finally know who they were. She opened a new email from a woman named Elaine. You reminded me of my first love. He left for war and never came back. I've spent 60 years never speaking his name. But now, I'm saying it out loud. Thank you. Emma blinked back tears. The weight of what this had become, it was almost too much to name. That afternoon, she bundled up in a thick coat and stepped outside. Her boots crunched through the snow as she made her way toward the barn, now fully converted into the listening house. Inside, it was warm and softly lit, full of photographs and stories lining the walls like museum art. The memory box in the center had overflowed weeks ago, so they had built shelves and files to hold the new additions. On one table, a man sat hunched over a letter, pen shaking slightly. On another, a young mother read to her child from a book of listener-submitted love notes. Emma didn't interrupt. She just watched, listened, received. She wandered out back toward the fence line, where the land dipped toward a small frozen pond. Jasper was there, scattering salt on the walkway. He looked up and gave her his usual, slow grin. Thought I'd find you out here, he said. I couldn't stay inside. The words won't come today. He shrugged. Maybe they're not supposed to. They stood in silence for a while. The wind whispered through the trees. Birds flitted overhead, tracing invisible lines in the sky. Jasper turned toward her. Can I show you something? She nodded. They walked side by side toward the east edge of the property, a part Emma hadn't visited in months. Jasper stopped near a small grove of pine trees. There, nestled between the trunks, was a narrow stone bench. At its base, a plaque read, "In memory of all the words never spoken, and the ones brave enough to be said." Emma touched the cold metal with her gloved fingers. Jasper, I thought this land deserved more than just buildings and rooms. It needed places for stillness too. She swallowed the lump in her throat. You keep finding ways to say the things I don't know how to. That's what friends do. Back at the farmhouse, Emma sat before her mic that night and pressed record. This is the final episode of Season 1. I don't know where to begin, but maybe the truth is, this season began long before I started recording. It began when my grandfather picked up a pen and poured out his heart to a woman he wasn't sure would ever read his words. It began when Lila chose to love and let go.
It began when I walked into an attic and found more than dust and silence. I found a story still waiting to be told. And it's not just theirs anymore. It's yours. To the mother who wrote in secret. To the father who never said sorry, but now wishes he had. To the teenager who wonders if they'll ever be enough. This story is proof that healing is real. That grace is possible. That some letters arrive right on time. Even if they were written a lifetime ago. Asterisk. She paused, then added, next season, I want to tell your stories. The ones you were afraid to share. The ones you still carry. Because when we share what we once hid, the world becomes a little more honest. A little more kind. Thank you for listening. I'll be here when you're ready to speak. She hit stop and sat in the silence that followed. That weekend, she held a special winter gathering, the final one before Christmas. Locals and out-of-towners arrived with scarves, gloves, and boxes of old letters wrapped in twine. Children sipped cocoa by the fireplace while their parents took turns reading stories aloud. And in the back of the room, unnoticed at first, an elderly woman sat quietly with a worn suitcase on her lap. Emma spotted her and approached gently. May I sit? The woman nodded. Emma settled beside her, heart curious. I'm Emma. The woman smiled. I know. I'm Margaret, Lila's younger cousin. Emma froze. I didn't know Lila had any living family. She kept us at a distance, Margaret said softly. After Eli, things changed. She went quiet. But I remember the stories. The laughter. The night she came home with eyes red from crying. Emma's voice cracked. She loved him. She never stopped. Margaret reached into her suitcase and pulled out a stack of envelopes. I found these in her attic after she passed. Letters. All addressed to E. She never sent them. I think she wanted them to find their way to him. Maybe through you. Emma's hands trembled as she accepted them. Dozens of letters. More pieces to the story. Still waiting. That night, under a sky full of stars, Emma returned to the willow tree. She held the letters against her chest, the locket warm beneath her sweater. She didn't say much, just a quiet whisper. She wrote back. And in the hush of that winter evening, Emma Harper finally understood. She wasn't just preserving a love story. She was finishing it. Chapter 14, The Words That Waited. The first letter began simply. Dear Eli, I don't know where you are, but I know you're not far. Emma sat at the attic desk with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a mug of tea beside her, and the letters from Lila spread gently before her like petals from a wilted rose. They were worn, yellowed, and creased from decades of waiting in silence. But they breathed. Every single one. Each envelope was dated, some from the weeks after Eli's final letter, others from years later. The ink varied, sometimes neat and tidy, other times rushed and teardrop-stained. But Lila had never stopped writing. Not really. Emma opened the first one, then the second, then the third. I was so angry at you. Not because you left, but because you didn't stay. Did you ever mean what you wrote? Did you want me to fight harder? Then, I passed the bakery today where we met. The awnings still faded red. A girl at the counter had your eyes. I cried in the parking lot for 20 minutes. Then, I got married, Eli. You probably knew that. He was kind, gentle, not you, but safe. Sometimes I hated him for not being you. And then I hated myself for that. Emma wiped a tear from her cheek. These were more than confessions. They were Lila's resurrection, the unfiltered voice of a woman who had loved deeply, grieved fiercely, and lived fully, even in her quiet. For the next 2 weeks, Emma recorded a special series of podcast episodes titled Letters Left Behind. Each episode featured one of Lila's letters, read in Emma's voice, framed with quiet piano, and accompanied by reflections from modern listeners who had submitted similar experiences. The response was overwhelming. One woman wrote, Lila's words became mine. I never knew how to say goodbye until I heard hers. Another man confessed, I've been keeping letters to my late wife in a drawer for 12 years. I read them all again tonight. Then I wrote her a new one. And one teenager submitted, I didn't know heartbreak could be holy. Now I do. One snowy morning, as Emma stepped out to get the mail, she found a small package on the porch. No return address. Inside was a framed photo. Eli and Lila, young and grinning on a park bench, his arms slung around her shoulders like he always meant to protect her. Taped to the frame was a note. They mattered. Thank you for proving it. Jasper helped her hang the photo in the barn. Right beside it, Emma placed a copy of their letters.
now bound together in a soft-covered book she'd published independently. The proceeds from the book went to a scholarship fund in Lila's name for underprivileged girls pursuing writing. Emma didn't advertise the book. She didn't have to. The story did all the work. One evening, as she prepared for a final reading before the year ended, Emma stood on the porch and looked out over the snowy land. She thought of her parents, how little they'd understood her yearning to stay. She thought of the loneliness she'd felt when she first moved in. She thought of the attic, the envelope, the turning of the very first page. And then she thought of what Jasper had once told her. The story wasn't finished yet. No, it wasn't. But it was healing. Inside, guests began to arrive for the reading. Old faces and new. Friends and strangers. One woman had driven 8 hours just to be there. A man came with his daughter, both clutching letters they'd written together. Emma stood by the door, greeting them one by one. Her heart full, her story fuller. She had come to the farmhouse to close a chapter. Instead, she had opened a library, and the letters still hadn't stopped coming. As the room filled with quiet music and flickering candles, Emma stepped to the front of the barn and held up Lila's final letter, the one that had stopped her in her tracks. She cleared her throat and began. Dear Eli, this will be my last letter. Not because I've stopped loving you, but because I've finally started loving myself. A hush fell over the room. I will not carry our what-ifs anymore. I will not wear your memory like a wound. I will remember you with softness, not sorrow. And I will forgive you, not because you asked, but because I can. Emma's voice cracked. She paused, gathering strength, then continued. I will keep living. I will laugh without guilt. I will write stories that don't need you to be the ending. And then, the final line. Goodbye, Eli. I hope you found peace. I hope I find it too. Emma closed the letter. Silence hung like mist. Then came the sound of sniffles. Then applause. Then the deep, full stillness that only arrives when everyone in the room has just felt the same ache. Later that night, Emma sat beside Jasper on the porch steps, legs wrapped in blankets, a thermos of cider between them. She finally let go. Emma whispered. Jasper nodded. And so did you. She smiled softly. I didn't realize how much of my life was borrowed. I was always waiting for someone else's words to give me meaning. You wrote your own now. Emma looked out at the land. You think they'd be proud of me? I know they would be. She leaned her head on his shoulder. The wind stirred gently, brushing her cheek like the softest goodbye. Chapter 15. The letter she left behind. Spring came like a sigh of relief. After months of snow and silence, the willow tree out front bloomed again, its green tendrils swaying like whispered benedictions. Birds nested in the rafters of the barn, wildflowers peeked through the fence line, and the old house felt alive in a way Emma had never known before. But something else had shifted, something deeper. Emma no longer walked the halls of her grandparents' home as a guest. She moved like the caretaker she'd become, not just of bricks and beams, but of memory, of story, of legacy. The letters, the podcast, the gatherings, they had all been seeds. Now the harvest had come. That morning, she stood in the attic with the sun pouring in, casting golden lines across the worn floorboards. The desk was scattered with notes, ideas for a new season, names of volunteers, designs for a traveling exhibit. But tucked between it all was a small box. Wooden. Simple. Inside it, one envelope. Her handwriting. The letter she had written to herself months ago. She opened it, slowly, reverently. Dear me, you made it. You didn't just find a story. You became one worth telling. And though you walked in with questions, you now walk out with roots. You are not lost. You are not behind. You are right on time. Emma smiled. Then, without hesitation, she added a postscript. P.S. The best stories are the ones still being written. That afternoon, she recorded the first episode of the second season. No fancy intro. No guest. Just her. Welcome back to the letter she was never meant to find. I'm Emma Harper, and I want to tell you something. Stories don't save people, but they remind us we're worth saving. Days turned into weeks, and the farm became more than a home. It became a sanctuary. Church groups booked retreats. Writing circles met every third Saturday. Teachers brought students on field trips to walk through the listening house and sit under the willow tree with journals and pens. And people kept writing in, not because Emma had all the answers, but because she had shown them how to ask the right questions. One morning, While sorting through the latest letters, she found one with no return address. The handwriting was familiar, old-fashioned, strong. Inside, Emma, asterisk, this will be my last letter. You never knew me. Not really. But I knew you. Asterisk. I was the man who sat 3 pews back at your grandfather's funeral. I served with Eli. I was there when he wrote that last letter. Asterisk. He told me about her. About Lila. About the one that got away. Said he'd never stop loving her. But what he didn't say, and what I only found out after, is that he left you something. Asterisk. Not just the house. He left you the choice to stay or go. And you stayed. That tells me everything I need to know. Carry the story well. Asterisk. A friend. Asterisk. Emma placed the letter on the mantel beside the photo of Eli and Lila. Another thread tied. Another mystery, gently closed. In the final scene of her season finale episode, Emma shared a story. Asterisk. There was once a girl who walked into an attic and found a letter. It wasn't addressed to her, but somehow, it had her name all over it. She followed its trail through grief, silence, memory, and healing. And in the end, she didn't just read someone else's words. She learned to write her own. Asterisk. She paused. Then, asterisk, if you're listening today, I want you to know, there is a letter with your name on it. Maybe it's not on paper. Maybe it's carved in your choices, stitched into your scars, or hiding in the quiet moments between breaths. But it's there, and you're the only one who can read it. Asterisk. Final lesson, family. Sometimes the stories that change us aren't loud. They don't scream across headlines or echo in applause. They come in quiet envelopes. In words someone was brave enough to write. In healing we didn't know we needed. Let this be your sign to write it. Write the apology. Write the memory. Write the goodbye. Write the beginning. And when you're ready, share it. Because your letter might be the one someone else has been waiting to find. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs it. Like, comment with your favorite moment, and subscribe for more beautiful, healing stories that remind us all. Some love stories are God-written, and they're never forgotten.